these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back to Hold These Truths. Today we have with us Mike Sommers. Mike, thanks for being with us. Mike is the CEO of the American Petroleum Institute, also former chief of staff to former House Speaker John Boehner. And I had forgotten about that fact, so I was like, oh man, we better hear some John Boehner stories during this podcast. But we're here to talk mostly about energy. And it's a timely topic given the sort of remarkably anti-fossil fuel energy policies put in place these last 4 years. We'll talk about what some of the more devastating ones have been, how we might reverse them, what the future of energy looks like, all of the above. There's plenty to talk about. So with the American Petroleum Institute, API, that's how we'll refer to it from here on out. It's an association of sorts, I suppose. Like it represents hundreds of oil and gas companies of all different sizes, and you represent them to Congress. You represent them in general. You guys put out ads. I mean, it's maybe you describe it better than I could.
API is the largest trade association in the world representing the oil and gas industry. We've been around for over 105 years, actually. Wow. The origins of this organization actually date back to World War I, when we had a supply challenge, and the federal government actually challenged the industry to come together to think about how we coordinate our activities. Yeah. So not only are we an advocacy organization that's been around for 100 plus years, but we're also the global standard setter for oil and gas. Yeah. So
back then the federal government wanted you.
That's exactly right. Okay. And it'll be nice to finally have an administration.
We're back to that.
We're back to having an administration that actually wants to work.
Pendulum likes to swing. Okay, let's actually. We have some serious questions, but really, what everyone wants to know is about Landman. So, I grew up in the oil and gas industry, and I never like worked as a roughneck out there. My stepbrother does, and so I got a little bit of insider info from him. I'm like that explosion from the first episode. He's like, that's not how it would happen. It was like totally unrealistic. Like, what do you have to say about this so far?
So about 6 months ago, we actually caught word that Landman was going to be a thing. And I'm a huge Yellowstone fan. I'm a huge fan of the whole Taylor Sheridan series of shows. But I picked up that Landman was going to be a thing. And API is actually the #1 advertiser now on the show.
Yeah, I've noticed.
And there's a reason why we're doing that. And that's because the show obviously portrays a very Hollywood version of the oil and gas industry. But it also is a very favorable version of the industry.
It is. Yeah, no, it is favorable.
But the one thing that we were concerned about is what you put your finger on, which is the safety aspect. Yeah. And the truth is, this industry is very safe. And
in the first 2 episodes, there's like multiple deaths. Right. Assassinations.
Right. Like, there's just Mexican drug cartels.
Cartel planes landing on trucks of fuel. I'm like, oh my God. I'm like, I study cartels kind of for a living. Like, it's like I'm the one guy who does it. And I'm not so sure that I think everything's exaggerated, right? It's not that there's no cartel investment, and obviously they're everywhere, right? But like to this extent, I haven't ever heard evidence of that, but I don't know.
So one of the things that we've tried to do is try to use it as an opportunity to educate people who are watching the show. So if you go to api.org/the real Landman, we actually have a site where you can look up, various industry terms, find out what's true about the industry. So, but it turns out what Taylor Sheridan has been all along, which is someone who has done a really good job of storytelling, has done a really good job of telling the story of American oil and gas.
It is good, and it's like, I don't know what his political leanings are, but there's been some like really clippable moments in Yellowstone and in Landman that are like, if you're part of what I call the rational environmentalists, you're like, oh, yeah, you just nailed it. And one was when Governor Dutton first became governor. He's having that meeting in the boardroom, and they're like talking about the sage grouse, and they're talking about like, yeah, we need to build these solar panels, and there's the sage grouse issue, and he's like, just hold on a second. Like, so where does the sage grouse live? In the sage, right? And so how much sage do you have to clear to put in your solar panels? Well, all of it. So how the fuck does that make any sense? It's like, and it's like, it was something like, he's like, what scares me about you? You're serious. Like, it was just such an amazing like moment. It's like, that's the exact argument we've been making. And then there was another clippable moment with Billy Bob Thornton. I forget the character's name. Whatever, doesn't matter. It's Billy Bob. Everybody knows Billy Bob.
Everybody knows Billy Bob.
And he's like, he's showing the new lawyer around, and who turns out to be a badass. You think she's not, but then she turns out to be awesome. And she's like, oh yeah, the renewable energy. You guys have that here? She's like, it's alternative energy. Don't call it green. Don't call it because. And then he goes into the facts. Yes. The facts that I say often, like in hearings and all that. He's like, all that plastic, where do you think that comes from? It's all shipped from China. And how much like steel do you think goes into each and every one of these things? Like there's like the amount of oil you need to just even make these things turn. Like it's just, do not call it green. It's alternative. And we use them because, he had a reason for it. We don't want to build power lines out here or something. I mean,
right.
It's all, it's just really well done little snippets like that I think tell the right story.
Yes.
Even if the little things are wrong, because I think my brother was like, that's not the wrench you would use. Like that's not how that explosion would happen. It's just you just wouldn't do that.
Right. But look, I give Taylor Sheridan a lot of credit. He has done a lot of research. He tells a really good story about the American oil industry, and we're proud of what they've developed here. Of course, they've sensationalized it a little bit. So what we're trying to do by
there's a lot of Friday Night Lights.
That's right. I've actually said
it's like the vibe is very Friday Night Lights. It's got Ellie Larder, and it's fun to watch.
I've actually said it's a combination of Dallas and Friday Night Lights.
Yeah, could be. All right, so that's Landman. I do suggest watch it. It's Taylor Sheridan hasn't missed yet. Honestly, the guy, whatever he touches seems to be gold. So,
did you see Jerry Jones was in the last episode too?
No, like I said, I'm not sure I'm caught up, I guess.
Yeah, the ninth episode, Jerry Jones has
okay,
a
why don't you just
cameo.
stop?
I don't want to be a spoiler alert here, right?
Here.
Yeah,
All right, come on. But I think, I'll say one more thing. Like the lunch they had in Dallas, like I swear, I think that's the real place where you actually, like, it's one of those clubs. Like I think I've been there.
Yeah.
I think they actually used the right place. I mean, some of that stuff's really accurate. Now, do they yell at each other like that? Probably. I don't know.
Well, the one thing they get wrong is that they think the whole oil industry is headquartered in Fort Worth.
That's
not where
weird.
it is.
Why?
Everybody's moved to Houston.
I don't know why. Yeah, that I didn't get. Like, why Dallas?
Right.
Fort
Even
Worth.
ExxonMobil has moved to your district.
It's all in my district. Yeah, it's all in the woodlands, and I don't know why Dallas and. Yeah, okay, one other thing that didn't make any sense. When Billy Bob's like, I gotta go back to Dallas. Like, you don't drive from Midland to Dallas.
No way.
Are you crazy?
Especially when
you're not poor. You're not poor. There's a million flights out of Midlands. Like, what are you talking about? Like, no one drives unless you need to like transport something. You're not driving. That was absurd. Anyway. Although I guess they had to drive because she had to get her car.
She had to go somewhere, yeah.
She had to get her car.
That's right.
But whatever.
Her Bentley.
But you could still fly there.
Right.
Anyway. All right. Enough about that. So where do we even begin here? Maybe with some basics. Here's a super basic question, which is like, where does most of our oil and gas come from? We're a major producer in the United States. That wasn't always the case. Like, it pains me to say that I'm pretty sure most of our we get more natural gas from Pennsylvania than Texas. But like, what is the general makeup of where it's drilled and where we get it?
Well, let's start with even going more basic. The world consumes 100 million barrels of oil every single day.
100 million.
100 million barrels of oil every single day. And that number is always going up. Mm-hmm. So the United States right now produces about 13.4 million barrels of oil a day. That has gone up considerably in the last few years. Mm-hmm. We actually saw a significant increase, of course, during the first Trump term, where we went up about 3 million barrels a day. During the first Trump term, we continued to go up during the Biden term after a lull during COVID. But the world's going to continue to consume a lot of oil and gas. But the truth is we're going to need a lot of energy going forward. So this isn't just an oil and gas story. This is an energy story. We're going to need more of it all. Texas is actually a great example of that. While about 50% of your power still comes from natural gas, you get a lot from wind and solar too. But you're always going to need natural gas to back it up.
Yeah, you got to
and
back
that's,
up.
That's the
It's
key.
intermittent energy.
It's intermittent energy.
You have to back it up. Let's focus on this one point you made. It's continued to go up, and that's the point that Democrats make often. They're like, we're not attacking the industry. I mean, oil production has gone up under the Biden administration. So how do you counter that, or agree with that, or what do you say to that?
Well, what I'd say is that it has a lot to do with the fact that everything the Biden administration has done has been to try to restrict oil and gas development on lands that they control. So leases were down 97% on federal lands. We only had one lease sale in the Gulf of the Gulf of America during the Biden administration. And that's only because it was mandated by the Inflation Reduction Act. So everywhere that they could control development, Alaska's another place where they took hundreds of thousands of acres offline from oil and gas development. Everywhere they could restrict development, they did. What has happened in the oil and gas industry is a technological revolution that really started in 2005 with the dawn of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. And as a consequence of that, we've been able to find oil and gas in places that we thought were dry fields. And that's what's really been the incredible story, particularly of the Permian Basin. I think the concern that everyone in the United States should have is that because they're continuing to restrict access to federal lands and federal waters, where's that next generation of oil and gas going to come from? Because we're going to need it for decades and decades to come, which is why what the Biden administration has done, which is really restrict the amount of oil and gas that we can produce, could have very far and long lasting consequences to the American people.
I mean, just today they announced a restriction on outer continental shelf offshore drilling.
625 million acres offshore. Most of these acres aren't currently being operated on.
Yeah.
But the case that I would make is that we don't know that they won't be operated on in the future, or we will need to tap them in the future. Just think about it. 20 years ago, we weren't operating in the Permian Basin. We were operating there, but that production continued to go down. And because of a technological revolution, because we continue to need these products, the Permian Basin became the resource of choice for the world.
And I think maybe what I would note too is, production went up in spite of your efforts, but it might have gone up further. So that's one thing. But the second thing is a lot of these EPA rules, DOE restrictions, all of that. It doesn't necessarily have the immediate term effect. It has a medium to long term effect because, right, you're discouraging investments, and when we talk about investments in the oil and gas industry, you're talking about 10, 20-year investments. And so you're not going to feel the pain of that until way later. So they can sort of clean their hands of it and say, oh, see, we didn't do anything. But the truth of the matter is these rules and regulations that they've been putting through the process for years since they started, they really only just went into effect like this year.
Well, I actually have a term for it. It's called the energy policy lag, that it takes 4 or 5 years for these policies to catch up with production.
Yeah, and then they're going to blame Trump.
Then they'll blame Trump,
Yeah.
if there's a decrease from production as a consequence of the decisions that they've made. But in the Gulf of Mexico alone, you think about the fact that there's a lease. The Gulf of America. The Gulf of America alone, there is a...
They're freedom fries. It's the Gulf of America. Get it right.
And why can't we rename it? I'm all for it.
It's not the Rio Grande, it's the Rio Grande.
In the Gulf of America alone, there is a lease that we are currently operating on that was leased under the Reagan administration. So your point about long-term investment is real, like particularly offshore. You're making these investments 1 year. It takes about 10 years to get it up and running. And then after that, you're operating on that lease for 30, 40, 50 years.
Yeah.
Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America still accounts for 14%.
Say it wrong one more time, you're out of this. You're out of here.
The Gulf of America counts for 14%, 2 million barrels a day of American production.
Yeah. Okay. So 14%, right? And then you got, do you even know the percentages off the top of your head?
Well, the Permian is by far is the biggest. That's 6 to 7 million barrels of oil a day.
Barrels. Explain the difference between drilling for oil and gas.
Well, they all come to the same hole, right? So in Texas, use the Texas example. You're getting gas when you're drilling for oil. It's called what we call associated gas. Yeah. In Pennsylvania, you're really just drilling for gas. So it's what they call dry gas. So it's just based on different geologies. You're still getting a lot of oil in that part of the country as well. For the example, the Utica Shale in Ohio, you're actually getting a lot of oil also. But mainly in the state of Pennsylvania, it's dry gas. You're using the same technology, the same techniques. But in Texas, there's a lot of gas too. You just happen to be getting the oil. You're really drilling for the oil.
You're doing both, yeah. That's just an important fact for people to know. I don't think it's always obvious to everyone. We just talk about this stuff like people know about it.
Yeah.
How many years left of reserves do you think we have in these, and especially the easier to drill? Because West Texas is easier to drill because it's private land.
That's right.
We don't have to deal with Biden administration restrictions. You talk about New Mexico, which I guess is technically part of the Permian Basin as well.
It is.
That is federal land,
Fully
right?
a third of the Permian Basin is in New Mexico, but it is federal lands there.
So it makes it tough.
It makes it tougher, but we've had success even under the Biden administration to continue to produce there.
Well, New Mexico knows that they need the taxes to fund their entire state.
Fully 50% of the New Mexico state budget is from the oil and gas industry. You'd think they'd be a little bit more friendly. We'd think they'd be a little more friendly to the industry.
Yeah, no, it's a super hyper left-wing government.
Maybe we should call it New America.
They just did something. Either the Biden administration or New Mexico did something which was detrimental to their own future. I can't remember what it was, though. Maybe you know off the top of your head.
Well, I mean, the regulatory regime in New Mexico is much more significant than it is just across the border in Texas. So they've put, new methane rules in particular that could be very damaging to the long-term health of the New Mexican side of the Permian Basin.
Again, another technical question. Methane is natural. They're the same.
They're the same.
We're talking about, when we say methane emissions, we're talking about just natural gas escaping.
Right. So, when the Democrats talk about imposing a quote-unquote methane fee, that is essentially a tax on natural gas.
Right. These are not separate gases just being exposed. Because some of these things are just important for people to know.
Yep.
Let's talk a little bit about how the U.S. industry leads the world in cleaner production of oil and gas. What are some of the steps we've taken on our own or forced to take by rules and lawmaking? How are we better? I mean, I don't know, let me just maybe just to set the tone here. There's a statistic out there, and I think it's a pretty good one. I think it comes from our national labs. That American natural gas sent to Europe is like 42% cleaner than Russian natural gas sent to Europe.
Right.
I wonder how they come up with that and why. Why is it cleaner? What do we do that's different?
Well, let's start, first of all, with what I call the American energy advantage. Why has this industry grown up here? Why are we now the largest oil and gas producer in the world? One of the reasons is just a fundamental constitutional principle. That is property rights. Mm-hmm. That the United States places a premium on the concept of private property rights. We also place a premium on contracts. And for someone who owns the land that they own that land all the way to the core of the earth. Mm-hmm. That is not true in any other country in the world. Most people, when you own land, you own basically the topsoil of that land. You don't have those mineral rights. And it is because of that.
That's interesting.
Yes.
So like other countries, okay.
So as a consequence of that, we have the rights on our private lands to do with it which makes sense on that land, including drill for oil. And that combination of private property and the sanctity of contracts has really led to the boom of the American oil and gas industry. You see it. Most of the production in the United States, as you mentioned before, is on private lands because the federal government can't control that land. That property owner in the Permian Basin, those fields have been worked for almost 100 years.
Yeah.
And new technology are allowing us to recapture.
Well, give me a comparison. Like Canada, the big oil producer, how do they do it differently, or is it similar?
Well, most of the Canadian oil, what we're getting, it's a kind of an unconventional approach to getting oil. So they're also basically mining for oil in the Canadian tar sands. So that's a completely different process.
Industry. Okay.
Completely different process. But again, most of that is on public lands that they are leasing.
Gotcha.
They will operate there for 50 years, get all the oil out of it, and then return it
and then
to
places
nature.
like Saudi Arabia, that's all government owned. That's
right.
all kingdom
That's
owned.
all kingdom
Russia, same-ish. Oligarchs, who knows?
Yeah, but one of the reasons why we can say that we do it better, faster, and cleaner is because American producers. One, we have an Environmental Protection Agency. We shouldn't underestimate the fact that the Environmental Protection Agency does have a role to play here.
Yeah.
But we also have an incentive. The people that are operating in these fields This is where they live. This is where they work. They don't want to live in a bad environment or pollute their own environment. These are private lands, and they're doing everything they can. And by the way, they are contractually obligated to do it in a certain way. Another factor is, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, the American Petroleum Institute maintains over 800 industry standards, which focus on environmental protection and safety and how we treat our workers. That's been a very
as many industries do. It's better to
well.
get ahead of the lawmaking.
That's right.
It's better to get ahead of the regulators. Just like, hey, we're already doing it. We got it. It makes everything easier for all of us.
But I will say, Russia, when the terrible situation when Russia invaded Ukraine, and we had to get gas to Europe as quickly as possible, we surged American liquefied natural gas to that country. We were able actually to cut off Russian crude into the United States without the United States even telling us. The oil industry did that on its own. We were not accepting any more crude oil. That is only because the American oil and gas industry has produced more than any other country in the history of time has produced.
What do you make of the argument? Because this is famously in the last year or so, Biden's Department of Energy put a pause on LNG exports, making the argument. What is their argument? They need to do a study on the economic benefits. Now, I think those studies are done, and the economic benefits are like, yeah, you should export more. But some of their what they'll say is, if we're exporting it, we have less supply here, which means our prices at home go up for our consumers. What's the answer to that?
Well, the answer is that the United States has more natural gas than we know what to do with. One of the reasons why the industry has had to flare in the Permian Basin, for example, is because that associated gas that comes when you're drilling for oil, there's no place for it to go, which is why infrastructure development is so very important. We have to get the infrastructure in place to move that gas.
Make that easier, by the way. That happens all over the place, and it's like, dude, just put that in a pipe and send it somewhere. But it doesn't, or in a truck. The economics don't make sense. How do we make those economics make sense?
Well, it's starting to make a lot more sense. Most of API members now aren't starting to produce on these fields without the infrastructure in place, and they do have an economic incentive to do that because the product that they're flaring, that is the product, right?
Well,
they
you can
sell
get
that
the tech
into the
industry
open
into this too, because what does the tech industry need now? They need these
More power,
supercomputers
that's
doing
right.
more crap. You can Bitcoin mine. There's a lot of Bitcoin mining going on in West Texas too, right? So
mining.
some of this is used to fuel generators that just Bitcoin mining is a whole other subject. We actually covered it on a recent podcast. But it takes a lot of computing power. You want to do AI generation and create these AI algorithms that requires large amounts of power.
Yes.
There's an interesting. I love to see all of this happening, whether it's nuclear energy doing it or using flaring or stopping flaring in order to use that energy, because you can build these supercomputer hubs anywhere. They don't have to be in a city or anything. They're just they can operate anywhere.
But what the Biden administration did just over a year ago, when they paused LNG export permits, it is hard to think of a worse policy that they put out during their administration.
How many contracts were lost?
Yes.
How many future potential partnerships were lost? How much more? And by the way, it's very easy to make the argument that you're going to see a net increase, large increase in global CO2 emissions for the simple reason that by nature of not doing an LNG export, you're telling country X that they're not getting your LNG, so they're going to build a coal plant.
That's right.
Because that's exactly what a developing country is going to do.
That's exactly right. Because these countries aren't going to stop. They need the energy. These countries are becoming closer to the middle class. And what do you need as soon as you start climbing up that ladder? You need more energy. Yeah. We'd prefer they get it from the United States, where we have an abundance of energy.
And we prefer it be cleaner natural gas.
That's exactly right.
This idea that they're all going to build solar panels and wind turbines is nonsense.
Well, let's just think about how foolhardy it was. Europe last year actually imported more Russian LNG than it has in the history of time. They essentially cut off the piped natural gas that they were getting from Russia and replaced it with LNG from Siberia. How foolhardy is that?
Yeah, and after Biden promised them a 60% increase, did that ever happen?
And where's it going to come from, right? That was far down the road. Hopefully, with a new president who's going to permit these things faster, we're going to be able to actually meet that commitment. We wouldn't have under President Biden.
Yeah, we're having trouble with a lot of these. Me and Senator Cruz just led a letter for one of these similar export facility, and where was it? Brownsville.
Brownsville. Yeah.
No, it's infuriating, but you know, and I've had Toby Rice on this podcast, and his company EQT had done a study that showed that, you know, if you just let us do what we wanted, we could probably quadruple exports over the next 10 years, and you do that, and it's the equivalent as long as that's, and this is where the government comes in, the State Department and our U.S. trade reps, as long as you're targeting that export at displacing foreign coal. That's like the equivalent of building solar panels in every single house in America, everyone using EVs, and all your energy coming from renewables. Yes. Like it's the equivalent, because displacing coal, which, you know, because natural gas, coal comparison and emissions is what, like
it's 50%. Yeah, it's 50% less emitting than coal.
And it's like, why not just like take on this low hanging fruit? And it's this constant battle with, I think, the radical environmentalists who want us to spend more money, get less from it. Why? What's your rationale? It feels good. I don't know.
Yeah,
it makes no sense. Yeah. So let's talk about a few other regulations that have been finalized into rules that are, I think, of extreme concern for our economy writ large. One is the twin tailpipe rule for passenger vehicles and heavy duty trucks. Let's talk about that one first. What is that? What's its intent, and is it reversible?
Yes. So there are kind of two rules that we're really following closely. One is out of the EPA, which is a new EPA tailpipe rule on greenhouse gas emissions. Mm-hmm. The new rule would essentially suggest that by 2032, 2/3 of the vehicles sold in the United States would have to be electric vehicles. Mm-hmm. Obviously, this does not make a lot of sense.
It doesn't say they have to be electric vehicles, but the tailpipe,
the standard
is so impossible to meet that it's effectively
That's exactly
mandated.
Right.
And that was their intent. They even say so out loud, I think, in some statements.
And then in addition to that, they pair it with the new CAFE rules, which would require the fuel economy to be significantly higher than it is today. These two in tandem, you know, would make it very difficult to sell an internal combustion engine in the United States going forward after 2032. In addition to that, a number of the states have taken it on their own, particularly California. California has put in place a rule that says you can't even sell an internal combustion engine after the year 2035. That's not bad enough. There are 17 states that actually follow the California standard. So it's one thing that California did it, but now that all these states have waved in to the California standard, that is a significant portion of the job of the car market.
And to my understanding, it's not as if the car industry has said, okay, like let's go full steam ahead on electric vehicles. If anything, it appears to me to be the opposite. They're not selling.
They're not. The American people have voted with their wallet here. These vehicles just aren't selling, particularly without the tax credit that would be in place. That went into effect. That could be repealed this year.
Yeah.
I think these sales for these electric vehicles.
It's likely something that's getting repealed.
Yeah. So, in an environment where that tax credit gets repealed, very few electric vehicles are going to be sold. And I do think, the American people have already said that these are just not vehicles that they want. I think the biggest problem that the car companies had, and that honestly that the Biden administration has put forward, is that they really skipped a step. The right next step for fuel efficiency is to push hybrids. And instead, they went whole hog into this EV future. Yeah. And when the infrastructure wasn't built, the demographic that is most concerned about being forced to buy an EV? It's moms.
Yeah.
Because they're concerned about being trapped somewhere without being able to charge their vehicle with their kids.
Of course.
And so the American people have rejected this. And the car companies are finally figuring this out. Yeah. And this is typical of the car companies. What they do is they cut a deal with Democrats when they're in office and say that they're going to produce all of these fuel-efficient vehicles. And then they turn around when Republicans are in office, and they cut a new deal to go back on the commitments that they made to Democrats. Yeah. The American people are sick of it. And it's time that we actually produce vehicles in this country that the American people want.
Yeah, hybrids, you don't need to. Do you need to charge? I guess it depends on the hybrid.
No, it depends
you
on.
Need to charge
if you look at a traditional hybrid, which would be like a Prius, they're basically charging as the vehicle is going or as the vehicle is braking. A plug-in hybrid is one where you can actually plug it in. It has battery. It can go for a certain period without having gasoline. also makes a ton of sense to have kind of a dual fuel technology. And then you have a full EV that you actually only can plug in. What's interesting, Toyota Motor Company has actually run the numbers on this, on the environmental impact. If you look at, the rare earth minerals that are required to make a full EV, for what you make a one Ford Lightning, their attempt at making a Ford pickup truck that's all EV, you can make one Ford Lightning, you can make 6 hybrids, or you could make plug-in hybrids, or you could make 90 conventional hybrids.
Yeah.
If you make 90 conventional hybrids, the GHG emissions saved is almost 2/3 better than if you're just producing that one Ford Lightning.
Wow.
So from an environmental perspective,
because
none of this made
because of
any
all
sense.
the minerals that are required
That's right.
to be dug up from the ground, which requires a lot of big machinery. It requires a lot of very environmentally detrimental processing that usually occurs in China to make this battery.
Yeah,
And-
so that simple calculation, 1,690, I think tells the story of how this isn't even environmentally the responsible
Well, I remember
thing to do.
Volkswagen and Volvo, I think both came out with the same study that did a realistic supply chain study of the whole thing, and their conclusion was you need about 70,000 miles driven in that EV to break even on the emissions. And it's like, well, who even's you're using an EV for like inner city travel mostly. Are you even going to drive 70,000 miles?
No.
So in the short term, you're actually just mathematically, you're increasing emissions in the short term drastically, actually.
And now most of them are leased. There's no way that those vehicles are being driven 70,000 miles. And most of that depends on where you're getting the power from. So if you have an EV in Wyoming, and trust me, nobody in Wyoming, unless you're in Jackson County, has an EV, 90% of the power in Wyoming is coming from coal. And so based on that study, you have to get to almost
probably more.
100,000 miles.
I think
before.
on that study they're probably averaging.
Yes.
They have to come up with some kind of assumptions. So there's that one. The other one that I think is worrisome is the Clean Power Plan, because that rule has been finalized, and that's going to be. So in summary, what that thing does is it says that all new natural gas power plants, have to capture 90% of their carbon emissions, which is not a technological by what year? 2032. By 2032. So what the heck is that going to do for our ability to produce power in this country?
Well,
because that technology does not exist.
It doesn't
You cannot
exist.
capture 90% right now.
And to give you some perspective as to how bad it is.
There's the one company, Net Power.
Net Power.
But it's in its infancy.
There are 0 natural gas powered plants that currently have carbon capture attached to them. 0. So this technology isn't quite there, and you don't even know how you're going to do it. You'd have to pipe it somewhere. You'd have to move it.
Net Power has an interesting technology they do. It's early though. I'm excited about it. It's great. I would love this, but you can't just you're putting a chilling effect on future energy production when we are in a stage in life where the old statistics where we're going to double our energy use by 2050, right? Or 50% increase by 2050. That's the one I keep hearing. I highly doubt that is accurate anymore, because I don't think that accounted for the massive increase in computing power and the energy associated with that. That's why Google's like, we're going to build 8 nuclear plants. I'm like, hell yeah. So the nuclear industry, by the way, I'm really excited about. Just I think there's going to be a resurgence, a renaissance of that, just because of big tech.
Yeah.
Because they know they need energy. They know they need to answer to the far left. They're like, okay, but we need energy that works. So let's build nuclear plants. And they're going to be able to scale, and I think nuclear will be a lot cheaper.
I hope that's true, because we're going to need nuclear to help power the future too. But in the meantime, we're going to need a heck of a lot of natural gas. You think about how much things have changed just in the 8 years since Donald Trump took office the first time.
Mm-hmm.
During the first 4 years of Donald Trump, we used about the same amount of energy in 2016 as we did in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And what's happening now, because of the dawn of data centers and more AI, Goldman Sachs suggests that we're going to need 10% more energy every year for the next 10 years. So that's 100% more energy than we use today.
I was right.
So we're going to need more. And the only way that we're going to do it is we're going to have to use all sources of energy going forward. I think actually, in many ways, Texas is the model because Texas actually does use all sources of energy to power the future.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question too, because I mean, we have 30% of our grid capacity is wind. It's an open question as to like, at what point do you have too much? And I think Texas has answered that question with with the great freeze that we had.
Yes.
And 30% might be in the max. I mean, unless you're also adding a ton more of backup, base load energy plants. Base load meaning nuclear, gas, or coal that can be turned on. So I mean, it's a subjective. The question. It's an it depends kind of answer, right? Yes. It depends on a lot of things: how your electrical grid works, where you are in the world, the climate, all sorts of things. But it has to be said that like you can never ever possibly have 100% wind or solar energy mix. You just cannot. And people will be like, well, you could use batteries. Well, the battery technology is not there, and you're talking about like a 4-hour charge. I mean, it's just not going to work. So I don't know. It is a good mix in Texas, but we're right now, I think, investing in more natural gas plants based on our experience with not having enough during a big freeze.
Well, and if ERCOT's right, that in the next 10 years, you're going to need the equivalent of a whole new New York City amount of power. On the Texas grid.
That's probably true.
You're going to, based on just the growth in Texas alone, and then you add more data centers and more AI and more people plugging into the grid, you're going to need a heck of a lot more power. And natural gas is going to end up being the primary source of power.
Yeah, you have to, at least in the immediate term, but it's certainly all of the above. Now, I guess maybe it's more a question for Congress, but and for the audience. But what our likelihood of reversing some of these extremely detrimental ones, it is specifically the tailpipe rule, and specifically the Clean Power Plan, because I mean these things will prevent us from having energy we need in the next 10 years, and the Biden administration will be such a long lost memory that no one will know to even blame them for it. They'll blame whoever's in office at that time, and that's just unacceptable. So, Lee Zeldin, who will be in charge of the EPA, will have to go through quite the battle right away and get started right away to repeal it. Of course, we can try and pass laws that simply make it go away, but we still don't have 60 votes in the Senate. Whether we can get some of this stuff through reconciliation is another open question for a parliamentarian. So we're not sure. I don't know if you have any opinions on that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think Congress is going to have its hand full. I do think it could be energy that helps pay for some of the other big priorities. I know the border is a huge issue in the state of Texas, for example. Mm-hmm. If we could mandate some lease sales onshore and off, reopen Alaska, really make sure that we get this energy system going.
That's true. It
again.
counts as a cost savings.
It would be a cost savings that we could do via reconciliation. We've done it before. ANWR helped pay for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act the first time. So there's precedent within the Senate that we can get actual mandated drilling done through the reconciliation process. So I'm optimistic about that. The agencies are going to be where all of the action is. We put out the API agenda recently. We call it the API 5-point roadmap. You can find it at api.org. We've actually put together detailed memos to every agency that touches our industry. So we put memos together for 10 different agencies, from the Department of Energy to the Department of Transportation to the Council on Environmental Quality, on specific things that they need to do to reinvigorate American energy. They're all on our website. There's no secret plan here. We're telling everybody exactly what this industry needs. Mm-hmm. So we're being fully transparent about it. So if your listeners want to check it out, api.org, you can find all of those memos right on our website.
Maybe last question. We've been talking about energy production this whole time, but petroleum is used for all sorts of things. It's always good to remind the public how much petroleum is used in our everyday lives. I mean, what would you say about that?
Well, it would be very hard to live a day without interacting with petroleum products. Yeah. In fact, the microphone that we're using today, your iPhone, the clothes you wear, everything that you interact with has a petroleum product in it. And it really is the reason why our world has been able to power itself forward. It is the it is the thing that the world cannot live without, particularly when you think about what modern life looks like.
Yeah.
And those petrochemicals are just in everything that you consume.
Yeah. It's quite the industry, and people don't even realize how good they have it. So this has been a great podcast. Mike, thanks for being on.
Thanks, Dan.